or something like that. Yeah, not exactly. And Daniel has done some quite well-known work. I suppose some of you might know of his work on explanation and understanding, published in some of the best journals in philosophy, philosophical studies, synthesis, and so on and so forth. He's also done a lot of empirical work on some of these questions, particular understanding, particularly with Tania Lombroso at Berkeley. When Tania was at Berkeley, he was her postdoc there for a few years. And then he came to Pitt first to work with me, then he was a fellow at the center, and we really enjoyed having him at the center then. And then he got his position in the School of Nursing at Pitt. It's a really real pleasure to have you back at the center to be talking about an issue in bioethics. So first few policy questions in this. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, so today we'll be talking about pursuit-worthy questions in health. I have some case studies. I have an idea that I want to float by people and maybe get some more feedback. The original title had to do with research, but the shift to questions is actually super important. So if you really don't like questions and you came to the wrong talk, I apologize, but hopefully that won't make a difference. And speaking of apologies, I have a few other ones. I've been kind of absent from the center lately. That's because I teach on Tuesdays and my partner has prenatal appointments on Fridays. So that sort of swamps center activities. My presentation style, for those of you who've never seen me talk before, as will come out later, I am level 2 autistic, so they'll be pacing, they'll be not looking at you. Hopefully you don't take offense at that. So this particular talk is a little more polemical than usual and arguably a little less philosophical. But I think they cover important topics, and I do think there are important things, pieces of progress to be made within the philosophy of science, within philosophy of medicine, and within bioethics, that this is just sort of starting to ask questions about. Also, one other thing is the major centerpiece of this is going to be a paper by DeMarco and Khalifa. I think the last time I was here, I've given lots of talks in between. I also talked about a paper by Khalifa. So I do promise I read other philosophers. He's good to read. He is. He's very good to read. And 90% of the time, I think he's absolutely off the mark. And then 10% of the time, I think, why didn't I publish this paper first? This is definitely in the 10%. This is a really great paper we'll be talking about. And I wish I'd had the ideas. Okay, so the outline of the talk, I'm going to talk about what's new and what's not new in the presentation, because some of this is going to be really familiar to a lot of you. Then I'm going to talk about pursuit worthiness, and this is where the DeMarco and Khalifa framework comes in particular. I'm going to do 3 case studies. I have until 1 o'clock, right? So that should be fine. That I think each exhibit slightly different aspects of what DeMarco and Khalifa are getting at. And then I'm going to have a brief interlude on something from political philosophy. I'm going to talk a very small amount about the concept of deliberative democracy, because this will lead into my tentative positive proposal about how to engage in ethical research in a way that incorporates populations that are very difficult for various reasons to incorporate. Okay, so here's what's not new in this talk. I think I'm going to argue that ignoring the lived experience of people who are affected by science or by a condition in particular in health will lead to bad science. That should be relatively familiar. I'm going to argue, this is not a philosophical point, but I am going to argue that at least with respect to some conditions, there shouldn't really be anything about us without us, and that includes political action, which is what it's usually used for, but also research. I'm going to ask what we mean by that via research. Then I'm going to do some case studies. The female hysteria case study is probably going to be really familiar to a lot of you. But then getting to what is new, I'm going to try and apply DeMarco and Khalifa's framework to these questions. The other 2 case studies I think are relatively, if not novel, at least interesting applications. I'm going to talk about autism spectrum disorder and I'm going to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome. By the way, I didn't come in the right order. I'm also, despite the practice turn in philosophy of science, I am going to be saying that when it comes especially to autism and CFS, scientists are just doing things badly, which is a bold claim, I think, to make sometimes, but I actually just got promoted to associate professor, so I might as well take that for and see how that goes. And then I'm going to have a tentative proposal of how to do deliberative research. There are still some spaces to be filled in with it, which I would love if you all have views. This thought that was supposed to appear earlier, but I don't love the term disorder for autism spectrum disorder. I think there are a lot of ways in which it's not disorder at all, but that is another paper that I would also love to give, though might not be the best fit here. So I'll start off with a recap of DeMarco and Khalifa's paper. This is 2022, is that right? Yeah. And it takes an approach that's very question-centered. And the idea is when people historically talked about what pursuits were worth engaging in science, they frequently dealt with topics and theories, but that wasn't really true to practicing science, where what was at issue was which question should we follow. So here are just some features of their view. There can be features of questions, so positive aspects, such that some scientists with the capability to do so should pursue those questions actively. That being said, there can be bugs such that no scientist should pursue them, or arguably that some scientists shouldn't pursue them. Authors focus on the question of pursuit of questions rather than theory, since that's what science actually does. They do say that criticism should be contrastive. What else? So if I ask the question, should scientists with capability C ask question Q about object O, there's going to be a contrast, like what other O should they have been looking at, or what other questions should they have been asking, or what other capabilities would have been relevant. And it's actually that last one that I'm going to focus. Well, I'm going to do some of each. I should note that with the case of moral bugs, they argue that if there's something morally wrong with a question, then arguably you don't need a better question to ask in order to reject it. You could just say, look, this is not something we should be doing. And in fact, one example of that is concerns about perpetuating pernicious stereotypes are compelling reasons for scientists to be accountable to the public and can be a vital basis for criticizing scientific pursuits, where again, pursuits here is usually meant to be specific questions. Okay. Ways a question could fail to be pursuit worthy. You could be asking about the wrong object. If you're asking about, if you're dealing, their example is with something that's responding to antibiotics and you're asking about the relevant virus, you've asked about the wrong thing because it's probably not a virus. You could be asking the wrong question about it. Instead of asking, say, what strain the bacteria is or what antibiotics would work best, you could be asking, I don't know, what it looks like, which is just not a useful question for various reasons. And in particular, what I'm going to focus on is the wrong scientists are asking questions about the objects. They focus a lot on scientists from the wrong fields, which is something we're all familiar with. Physicists stepping over their territory and talking about, I don't know, philosophy or biology. This is all something we know, but they also talk about epistemic standpoints, which is also probably familiar, about how people, especially from oppressed populations, might have in some ways privileged vantage points to ask certain questions. And I'm going to look at versions of all three failings. Okay, so there are going to be 3 case studies. I'm going to talk about female hysteria, which is probably familiar. I'm going to talk about autism, and I'm going to talk about chronic fatigue. Okay, so first, for each of these, I'm going to talk about the harms associated with the condition. And here's why the shift between research areas and pursuits in terms of questions is particularly important, because I'm going to argue that in 2 of the 3 cases, these are really good areas of research. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be researching there. I'm just going to be saying that scientists are going to be asking the wrong questions. So first, I would normally do the harms associated with female hysteria, but I'm going to leave that section intentionally blank for reasons that might be obvious, and if not, they will be soon. So what do we get wrong about female hysteria? So maybe not everyone in this room, but a lot of people in this room probably know that this was a BS and largely misogynistic diagnosis. Pretty much anytime a woman was doing anything that was not approved of, this was a fairly standard thing to say that they had. It lumped together a variety of actual conditions, anxiety disorders, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, various non-conditions. So if a woman had lower sex drive, and sometimes it actually encoded over power imbalances. So if the woman was showing lack of obedience, this could be diagnosed. Famously, the original term for hysteria is originally blamed on the wandering uterus, which is also not a thing. There has been a movement, I should mention, to reclaim the term hysteria, but I would argue that's either changing the meaning of the term or introducing a new one. If Darryl was here, which I don't think he is, there might be something open texture going on where the term is changing again to being something that's actually like useful. But I think traditional female hysteria just wasn't a relevant thing. So what were the problems with pursuing question of how to treat female hysteria? It was the wrong object because there was no object. There was nothing there to be treated. Or perhaps more precisely, for those of you, since we're at Pitt, who are fans of camp and such, maybe there were many confused objects, like, you know, people have argued for mass and other such concepts. But either way, there wasn't one thing there. Now, not surprisingly, for many, many centuries, it was fairly exclusively male doctors doing the research. Obvious and extremely unoriginal hypothesis. 2, the fact that it was male doctors was at least partially the cause of 1, that they were looking at an object that wasn't really there. Most women can probably say that their moving uterus wasn't the problem with, say, lower sex drive or lack of obedience. Okay, why I left the harm section blank? I'd have also left the harm section blank for like phlogiston poisoning. There can't be harms for something that's not a real thing. So I would have left that section blank too. So what is the solution to the fact that female hysteria is the wrong object to be asking questions about? Well, an obvious fix, based on, again, the sample is to have more female researchers. But, and this is going to be the recurring theme of the talk, is not about female researchers specifically, but is it always viable to have the people affected by conditions be active parts of the research? And while obviously that's not an issue for women, you might wonder about people who specifically suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or severe anxiety disorder. Is it reasonable to say, look, if we want good treatments for this subcondition of PTSD, people with PTSD have to do the research? I'm obviously not saying that people with PTSD can't do research. I just think it might not always be fair to expect them to do that in order for regular treatments to become available. Okay, let's talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorder. I'll start with some of the harms associated with it. Again, I'm not always going to be making causal claims. Most of these, I would argue, are societal harms. A couple of them might be biological. But there are very real harms that make this a legitimate area of research, even if I'm going to argue we asked very much the wrong question about it. So I'll just try and do this part quickly because it's not really philosophical, it's just empirical. There are education disparities with autistic children. They're 150% more likely to be suspended. And not surprisingly, data show association between suspension and poor academic achievement. Yes, obviously there are compounds there. There's general degradation. This is mostly qualitative studies that show that autistic children are thought of as naughty children or slow learners. One study from Canada was about neurodivergent students generally, not just autistic students. With lower education parents in particular were half as likely to complete high school as the relative neurotypical group. 20% of autistic students have been excluded from classrooms altogether due to lack of a qualified teacher. And there's increased rates of being bullied. Now, this is actually kind of interesting, it has nothing to do with the talk. But so I found that 38% of autistic children in a 1-month period reported being bullied. I could not find the stats on neurotypicals. That's probably just bad research on my part, but it's weird that it was easier to find it for the autistic children. But it seems to be about 20%. That's my best guess from some other studies. Oops, one animation out of order. So workplace disparities, there are a lot of these. These are probably the most poignant. The US autistic full employment rate is about 15%. 32%, only 32% of us are in some paid position. 77% want to work. And again, notice the contrast there. 48% report bullying or harassment at work. Well, one study found that only 53% of autistic adults had ever had a paying job, compared 80% of speech and language impaired, learning impaired, or with emotional difficulties had trouble ever having a paying job. And the baseline is 90% of neurotypicals adults have had a paying job at some point. 45% feel overqualified or are overqualified for the job they do have. I'm very much not in that 45%. I really like my job. So that worked out. And there are various issues employers report with autistic workers, most of which seem like a better social structure could handle. Difficulty understanding instructions, asking too many questions. Those are kind of in tension with each other, because you would think you would want people asking questions if you thought they had difficulty understanding instructions. Not interacting with supervisors enough. These are standard social deficiencies. You might have heard of being social at the wrong time, not following social norms. So you see that a lot of this is kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, and a belief that autistic workers are more expensive. And the last one I'm going to do, I'm going a little faster than I intended actually, is I'm going to talk about healthcare disparities. There's increased rates of mental illness. Life expectancy is 20 to 36 years shorter. That one, I honestly don't know to what extent that's social and to what extent that's biological. But either way, it suggests that there is something that should be researched somewhere. And so that's very much not what I'm denying. Lower socioeconomic status, receive fewer treatment options. At least 29% report of autistic individuals report more difficulty finding a primary care physician, or they report delayed care for even basic things. And not surprisingly, delayed care is generally associated with higher emergency department usage, which in turn leads to even greater costs. Another interesting thing about, so this could have gone under healthcare or probably education, autistic children have the lowest prevalence of sexual education among any disability population that we've tracked, but obviously even more so compared to neurotypical populations. There is this, I don't know what the right word is, desexualization of autistic individuals and also individuals with other developmental disabilities, all of which will lead to some very real problems. Sorry, I don't see how many slides I have left because Zoom is blocking it. But we'll hope this is timing right. So autism spectrum disorder, what do we get wrong? Well, so I'm going to get myself maybe in trouble here by picking out a particular organization. So the main lobbying group for autistic issues, and in particular autistic parents, is Autism Speaks. And for many, many years until relatively recently, they focused on curing autism. And they still are largely focused on prevention of autism. And last time I checked, which was admittedly a couple months ago, there was only one autistic board member on Autism Speaks. It was a lot of parents, a lot of other professionals. And it was even hard to find out one member. They didn't seem to think this was a relevant feature for advocating what is best for autistic people to actually have autistic voices. This is something that has been partially my bane personally, which is NIH, the National Institute of Health, frequently issues these calls for papers. So I don't know how many of you work in health, but you've probably seen them. Funding notices. Every once in a while, I get really excited because I'm like, oh, there's an opportunity for autism research here. Every single time I get disappointed because with one sort of exception, they focus on etiology, where it is causing autism, which again suggests that the goal is simply prevention or cure. And you might think that all sounds fine. Even the traditional Autism Speaks puzzle logo here, which has been sort of taken off, is a little bit problematic from the perspective of people who I know and autistic self-advocacy network or networks, autistic self-advocacy groups, of which we actually have a few in Pennsylvania, which is kind of cool, suggesting that the goal is to fit autistic people into a pre-existing puzzle framework, which just doesn't seem like the right outlook. And in fact, if you look at organizations that have more direct autistic representation, like autistic self-advocates, such as Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, me, there is a much stronger sense that curing is simply not what we're interested in. That this is part of an identity. There's a reason that for many disabilities, I always forget which is which, they use person first language, someone who is paralyzed, autism to the extent that there are data, most of us is from Britain, but there's recently been some data from the US, tend to prefer identity first language, assuming I'm not reversing which is which. And that's because it is frequently part of our identity, which is not something we would want prevented or cured. Now, this is admittedly fairly subjective. We think there are obviously many disagreements within a community. I don't want to express anything as homogeneous and monolithic, but there is certainly an underrated extent to which actually autistic individuals think that the goal should not be cure or prevention, but rather some sort of amelioration of the things that are actually problematic. Increased anxiety, maybe communication skills. Now you might be worried here if you have this distinction in your mind between lower functioning and higher functioning autistic people, because it is a spectrum, that maybe sure, Daniel and people who can organize into large advocacy groups thinks there shouldn't be a cure, but maybe people who have much more severe, say, verbal communication difficulties or other sorts of more severe issues coping with life, they would want a cure. It's not clear this is a distinction that holds up particularly well between high functioning and low functioning autistic individuals as an intrinsic feature. There are data to suggest that if you set up the right social structures, we can try and get everyone to flourish and everyone to be relatively what we might think of as high functioning. There's this sense that autistics who can't speak verbally are therefore unable to communicate, but really, again, most of the people who have looked at this have found that it is possible to find an avenue of communication one way or another, something like AAC. I forgot what that stands for, augmentative communication, I forget the other A, signing, just other indications that can be translated. So I've given talks on this general field, not this talk, before, and frequently I get pushback that we should be trying to cure autism. That pushback has always been from parents and professionals. One time, there was a parent who said, look, my kid really likes the fact that they're now mostly cured. She then asked the kid to verify that, and he was conspicuously silent. And he was speaking, that wasn't conspicuous in the sense that he was nonverbal, but in the sense that he didn't actually necessarily agree. And there are all sorts of data, which I could give in another talk, that trying to cure autism leads to all sorts of problems. Just masking, with camouflaging. Okay, where am I going with all this? We should be asking some question, i.e., how can we make lives better for autistic folks? But the NIH and the biggest lobbying groups are presently asking the wrong question, which is how do we cure or prevent autism? So the research area is good. The object is good, sort of. Again, there are problems with how we conceptualize autism, but it's not nearly as bad as something like female hysteria, much less, phlogiston. But the question is wrong. And again, it's not hard to imagine a link between the lack of representation in a place like Autism Speaks. I tried to find autistic individuals on the NIH board. That also proved surprisingly difficult. And the fact that we're asking the wrong question. And again, this is something. So the marketing beliefs are interesting here because they do talk about standpoints and capabilities. Sometimes they treat this as an independent variable of a problem with a question. Sometimes they suggest that having the wrong capabilities can lead to the wrong questions or objects. I'm leaning pretty heavily on that second possibility, that having the wrong people asking the question will lead to the wrong question or the wrong object. Okay, so solution to what's wrong with the question involving autism spectrum disorder. Again, obvious solution you're going to go with first is more autistic researchers, but arguably variant of the same question I raised before. Can autistic researchers really represent nonverbal autistics particularly well? And can nonverbal autistics be equal partners in research? So, I mean, the obvious answer to don't do research without us is do research with us. But I think that leaves open the question of how. I mean, getting a PhD and running a study is like kind of hard, which probably most of you know. So is it possible? I mean, I had sufficient verbal skills to pull it off. Not everyone I know in the community necessarily could. How can they be incorporated as part of a research team? Or if not as part of a research team, as I'll argue, is there another way to properly incorporate autistic viewpoints? Yeah, so obviously this will exist on a continuum between people who are readily able to participate as full collaborators in research. But at the other extreme is it would be difficult. I don't think it's impossible. I think nonverbal autistics can definitely achieve academic success and can definitely be heavily involved in research, but I think it's a big one. And maybe that's the right solution, but I want to see if we can do something better. Okay, so that was it for autism spectrum disorder. Now I want to talk a little bit about chronic fatigue syndrome and some of the harms associated with it. I won't give my own definitions. It's really hard to do without sounding belittling for reasons that might become apparent. So I'm going to do something I always tell my students not to do, which is just to cite a definition from somewhere else for something. So this is courtesy of the Mayo Clinic. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a complicated disorder. It causes extreme fatigue that lasts for at least 6 months and is, I'd say, usually, I'll have some data on this, lifelong. Symptoms worsen with physical or mental activity. That's going to be important, but don't usually improve with rest or don't fully improve with rest. The cause is totally unknown. There are many theories. It could be triggered by a combination of factors. There is no single test to confirm a diagnosis. You need a variety of medical tests to basically rule out everything else. So treatment for the condition focuses on using symptoms, which is good. The reason I didn't want to do this myself is it's easy to talk about chronic fatigue and make it sound like, oh, these are people who are tired. And that doesn't even close to capture the experience. So I wanted to get a more official statement of the extreme ways this can influence people's lives. So this is a life-altering condition. It makes it difficult to impossible to work, to enjoy mainly the daily activities, etc. And now we'll talk about some harms associated with CFS. So there is different levels of severity. There are thought to be 2 million plus people infected, sick. We don't know if it's an infection in the US. So that's more than, for example, lupus or MS, which get a lot more press. And even then, it's thought to be massively underdiagnosed. The vast majority of physicians simply do not know what they're looking for with chronic fatigue syndrome, even though, again, it is more common than lupus, we think. People just don't know to look for it. So what are the different levels of severity? Mild involves a 50% reduction in activity from what you were able to do before the illness. Moderate, people can be mostly housebound. Again, it is easy to underestimate how incredibly life-altering this condition can be. 25% of people are house or bedbound. Severe, people can actually just be mainly bedridden for vast amounts of time, again, 6 months to their entire lives. Very, very severe, completely bedridden, and can't even do basic activities, feeding themselves, hydrating themselves, potentially using the bathroom. They just do not have the energy for this. Severity can vary over time. You can start off with a less severe condition and get more. It can get better, although frequently that direction is less common. Significant recovery is less, there's a letter there, is less than 21% of patients recover. So I said it's at least 6 months. Most people don't recover significantly at all. Again, significant recovery rate is less than 21%. Full recovery rate is obviously something lower than that. Lack of awareness of CFS is extremely widespread, and it can frequently delay diagnosis and treatment. One thing that's worth noting is that 6 in 10 people in a survey who brought up CFS with their healthcare professional said that they felt they were not taken seriously. Now, I had a video here and we tried really hard to make the tech work and it didn't. But you give a talk with the tech you have, not the tech you want. So I will now act it out. So in I think the very first episode of the show House MD, someone comes to House and says that they're chronically fatigued, and they look it up on the internet and they think they have CFS. House kind of rolls his eyes, goes outside, gets a fistful of chiclets, brings them back, gives them to the person, and sure enough, the person feels better and comes back for 4 meds. So this is the extent, this is how far, I think there are a couple things going on there. One of them is the extent to which people consider CFS not either a real disorder or not a serious disorder. I think there are also interesting questions to be raised about self-diagnosis of conditions, about people's ability to find out about themselves for relatively rare conditions, the role of Google in self-diagnosis. So I think that minute would have been a really interesting clip, but we don't have it. So just take my word. It's interesting. Okay, so what are some medical and employment issues for people with CFS? Notice, by the way, I switched to people with CFS as opposed to chronically fatigued people. That's not accidental. This is a condition that they would all, not they would all, that most would want cured if they could. It is not, while it's arguably part of their identity and that is how they identify, it's not, it's something they try to overcome. It's not part of who they are. So, okay, people with CFS, constantly tired for, again, 6+ months, and for 79% of people, potentially forever, with no help from rest. There are various comorbidities with conditions that are generally not pre-existing, and so they seem to either be caused by the CFS or, joint cause, whatever causes CFS also cause them. Chronic headaches, depression, that could definitely be caused by the CFS. Anxiety, fibromyalgia, which is a whole other thing that's arguably underdiagnosed and underappreciated. Mast cell activation disorder and connective tissue problems, joint issues, that sort of thing. Unsurprisingly, and this one presumably is causal, or at least partially causal, having CFS is massively stress-inducing. People with CFS are more than twice as likely as people without to be unemployed. And yeah, it can be very hard because it's a rare condition. It can be hard even to get disability, to get unemployment. It's just really kind of a mess. Okay, So let's look at some of the science that's been done about CFS and the sorts of questions people have asked. Now, the biggest study of how to treat people with CFS is called the PACE study. It was done in the UK. It was a randomized controlled trial with 600 plus participants. So yay, that's good. We like randomized controlled trials. That's good science usually. It is treated as the most definitive study of CFS, especially in the UK. And it pronounced that CFS was primarily a mental illness. So what should you do about it? They recommended cognitive behavioral therapy, which is probably mostly fine, and graded exercise therapy, where people ramped up how much energy they utilize, because look, if this is a mental illness and they're not really physically disabled, then just doing more exercise should fix it. Now, there are problems with the scientific merit of this particular study, which is disturbing given that it is the basis for treatment in the national health system in the UK and in some places here. This one's just mind-blowing. The threshold for having CFS changed mid-study, like how exhausted you had to be, how often, so that people who underwent no change might have been classified as having CFS at the beginning, but not the end. No idea how anyone thought that was okay. The authors claim that all they claim is that this didn't affect the final result, but there's no particularly good explanation for why you would ever do this. It just seems like a violation of the most basic adherence to research protocols. There were other issues of scientific merit. Somewhere in the middle of the study, the author sent out a newsletter saying that cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exercise therapy were the government-approved treatments. Now, obviously, this was not a double-blind study. You knew if you were getting one of these treatments. So this would lead to, even if it was doing nothing medically, a fairly obvious placebo effect in that you were just told that this was the thing that's going to work. It is also not clear of the group that was assigned graded exercise therapy, how much they actually followed those instructions. I mean, the whole study was just kind of a mess. Authors claim that, okay, here's where we get to sort of potentially more interesting or controversial points. The authors claim that objectors to their study are just doing it because they trivialize mental illness. They're just dismissing the possibility that CFS is a mental illness, and that's because they say CFS is real, and they say mental illness isn't real. So that is the response to the objections to this particular study. And I think that's really largely a straw man for reasons we'll get to in a minute. Mostly because it seems like it was a bad study. Now, what are the costs of this study and the fact that it's taken seriously as the standard of treatment, particularly in the UK? Well, there are very real potential side effects with exercise. You might actually remember that from the Mayo Clinic definition. Fatigue is generally worsened by exertion. And in fact, there's frequently a 24 to 48 hour lag between when someone exercises and when their condition gets worse. So it's actually really hard to know in real time that you're doing damage. Potential stigmatization of those with persistent CFS. And again, you can go back to the house clip, which we didn't see. But that it's treated, again, I'm going to say for better or worse, but just for worse. There is stigmatization of mental illness. And so this does arguably play into that. And it gives a sense that, well, if graded exercise would help them better, then maybe help them get better, then maybe they're just being lazy and not exercising enough. This conception, again, for worse, that it's all in their heads, which is not something you should think of any mental illness. Again, see that house clip. It becomes more difficult to argue that you have a persistent and untreatable disability when there's a fictional treatment. And again, no, I think their counter objection was a strong man. I don't know about other people, but I at least am absolutely not claiming mental illnesses are any less real than somatic illnesses. At my moment, I suffer from pretty severe depression, and I would definitely trade that for most somatic illnesses or many. So mental illnesses are very real, they're very life-affecting. It just doesn't seem that's what's going on here, both because the science was bad and because it seems to be making it worse, and because it seems to have very real, again, maybe it's true, but it seems like it has very real physical costs. And confusing mental illness with somatic illnesses just has very real consequences. Okay, to recap where we are so far. Good, on time. Lack of capacity in the Marco and Khalifa sense leads to, in the case of autism, treatment of a mental illness that is not an illness. In the case of CFS, treatment of a mental illness that is probably not mental. In the case of fetal hysteria, treatment of a something or other illness that really isn't anything in the first place, or perhaps is many things. This has to do with what Khalifa and Marco talk about as bugs in question asking. If a question presupposes a theory that we're pretty sure is inferior to one already have, then people shouldn't be pursuing that question. Again, pretty obvious in the case of female hysteria, a little less obvious, but I think still true in the case of autism as an identity-defining type of neurodiversity. Less clear in the case of CFS, where we don't really have a significantly better option, but we think it might be viral or something like that. Most relevantly, if pursuing a question would cause significant moral harm, then no scientist should pursue that question. Oops. Okay, brief interlude. I want to talk about something that seems totally random, but it's part of an idea I have that I just want to throw in the blender and see if anything cool comes out. So how do we settle political questions in a pluralistic society? Well, there's democracies, including republics. I'm not making that kind of distinction, where we settle questions in some ways by voting. But a minute's worth of thinking, if you haven't already, will reveal the problems with that. There's a tyranny of the majority. A lot of people might be better off if a small subpopulation were slaves. That doesn't make it good. There is uninformed voting against people's own values based on false empirical beliefs. If you wanted to defund the COVID vaccine because you think it causes more COVID, and you voted accordingly, everyone's getting hurt by voting. So what's the potential alternative? One thing that people have proposed is deliberative democracy, where, something's good about democracy, something's good about democratic processes, but it's not in the particular procedure. It's not actually in the voting. It's not even in respect for individuals' interests per se, but rather it's respect for individuals being entitled to be bound only by reasons that they would accept as legitimate reasons. So it's almost a combination of something Kantian with political theory. Reasons can be acceptable as legitimate for individuals, even if they were ultimately to vote against them as insufficient to support the policy in question. So again, if you think about COVID vaccines, they benefit the vast majority of the population. People would give reasons like, I don't want to get COVID, but they would have false empirical beliefs. But if we were to enact, say, a vaccine mandate, which is something I've argued for elsewhere, it would be based on reasons that they would find acceptable, even if they would actually reject a specific policy. The emphasis is on the role of reason sharing and reason accepting, rather than mere information transmission and bargaining, as we get in a more typical democracy or republic. A little bit more on deliberative democracy. Obviously, if you want to know what people value, the best method might just be to have them talk, but only under circumstances where they are presented accurate information. Here's just a quote. Deliberative democracy does not just assume equality, but rather creates the conditions for it. A framework of social and institutional conditions that facilitates free discussion among equal citizens by providing the favorable conditions for participation, association, and expression. So what are some good things about deliberative democracy? It seems to be good for justice. It's promoted by the requirement that all policies be based on reasons that would be acceptable to each and every citizen within a community. Even if the policy isn't ultimately to the individual's satisfaction, minority populations' values and ends can't simply be subsumed. Every individual has to be such that the type of reason would be acceptable to them. Obviously, there's a lot of devil in the details there, but this isn't totally a political philosophy talk, so I won't get into them. It's also valuable in the sense that it involves respect for persons, because, again, reasons have to be acceptable to individuals given the values they actually have, rather than some idealized notion of what values the majority thinks they should have. Maybe it leads to social cohesion, no solid data there. Here's just a cool example. I mean, Edward mentioned I worked for Tanya Lombroso. I got this from her. There was an impasse in policing in Denver where the population thought the police were being too brutal and shooting too many people and killing, too many people. The police thought it was necessary to protect themselves. It seemed like there was a fundamental disagreement, but once they looked at the actual values involved, it turns out they were compatible. Citizens just wanted people to stop getting killed. Police wanted to make themselves be able to stop perpetrators. It turns out they found a special type of bullet that had very good stopping power and relatively low fatality rate. And by effectively, rather than just the citizens trying to outvote the police, or engaging in some bargaining, by looking at the fundamental reasons that everyone had, they were able to reach an accommodation that was really acceptable to all parties. Okay, so why did I talk about deliberative democracy? I like to think that maybe there's something we can learn from it for how we should go about engaging people in research, where once again, the key is not necessarily actually having people involved directly, if you can somehow involve what's valuable to them. So in deliberative democracy, direct representation is valuable, but is not strictly speaking essentials. What matters is knowing what sorts of reasons people would find acceptable. Okay, having people implement those reasons in the form of policymaking might be ideal, or even having them speak to those reasons directly in situations like focus group might be the most effective way to discuss what kind of reasons are acceptable to people. But when neither option is available, there might or might not be alternatives. Questions about what is pursuit worthy, I think, are questions about reasons. So I think there is a connection here. What sorts of reasons are important to people, either in terms of pursuing questions or in terms of policy decisions. So here's a possible proposal. We could use the ideas of how deliberative democracy says political decisions should be made to inform how research decisions should be made, and call this deliberative research. So direct engagement with subject populations in environment designed to draw out their values. And this won't necessarily be a lab. I mean, a focus group, narrowly tailored focus group could be nice, but it could be something more informal, just anything that tries to get at people's values. We could use indirect engagement to get a read on what kinds of reasons are important to people. Okay, here's where I get a little nervous about my own idea. For example, you could look at advocacy works, particularly from groups that have good representation in them. So things like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Maybe you could look at social media posts to try and provide researchers with the information they need on the kind of reasons their target populations would consider legitimate. Here's where I start to get a little bit queasy. I'm not claiming that others can come to understand any of women, autistics, or people with CFS just by looking at Facebook posts. That would be patronizing and marginalizing. But could that be one channel among many? Maybe. Okay, I'm still a little bit worried that that's going to end up being patronizing and marginalizing. So people can come up with ideas for how we can look at statements and publications of those affected and gather what reasons are important without imposing our pre-existing framework on what should be important. I'm kind of open to ideas here. But again, that's just one idea. The bigger key would be involving people in ways that meet their capacities without necessarily being directly part of the research. And the key is that the populations affected might not have the expertise or the energy to craft policies themselves. That's why deliberative democracy is important. In the case of those, I think that echoes two of our three cases, but particularly CFS, they might lack the energy, not just as a contingent matter to be involved in the research, but as an effect of the very condition that they want to investigate. I think even people with relatively mild CFS would have difficulty being full participants or full participants as researchers. Okay, so there are reasons in our cases that direct guidance or voting doesn't work. So in the case of female hysteria, the reason for direct engagement are various. So for example, people who have been diagnosed with it, which is hopefully not anyone recently, might have something like PTSD. Is there a possibility of clear communication of values? Sure, perfect. This can be done in a correctly structured environment. Something non-threatening in the case of PTSD, with appropriately managed questions to get at what's valuable without necessarily having to involve them in doing research that could have various triggers. CFS, what's the reason for difficulty in engagement, lack of energy? Again, that sounds trivializing, and I apologize, but I don't have a better way to put it. And again, though, this could be gotten around in a correctly structured environment. We could have the possibility of clear communication of values. If people could do it from their bed, on Zoom links, and figure out, okay, what's important to you about this condition? Is exercise something that you think, well, is exercise something that helps you? Is exercise something that you don't want to do or just that's harmful for you? I think that could be helpful. In the case of autism in particular, there are potential communication difficulties, but one thing that's thought by both autistic researchers and researchers on autism is that communication is almost always possible, even by creative venues. So if someone can't participate directly as a researcher, we can give them AAC technology to try to convey their values. Okay, so in conclusion, I forgot to put a concluding slide up, but I think there are areas of research that are worth looking at, that are important. I think frequently health researchers ask the wrong questions in the sense that they have bugs, both that are scientific and that are potentially morally pernicious. And I think a reason for that is that there's not sufficient involvement by people with the condition. In an ideal world, we would just have people with the condition be parts of research teams. But given that some conditions themselves preclude that, I think we need to devise some sort of new system for making sure, in order even to get IRB approval, you have sufficient input from the target population. I've tried to think of what such a feedback mechanism might look like. I don't know I've been particularly successful there, but largely I wanted to highlight the problem and at least gesture towards what I think might be an appropriate solution. Okay.
Right, so we take a 2-minute break and then we'll have half an hour question.